it. Question for Mr. Barber. I believe you said that the main motivation for taking the risk is the possible desirable economic impact. There's another aspect, and that is the effect on the environment. And the question of whether the use of natural gas is much kinder in terms of greenhouse gas emissions than coal, and can we replace the use of coal that way? There is some controversy at the moment concerning that, but suppose the controversy ends up being settled that natural gas produces significantly less greenhouse gas emissions than coal. How would you then respond to the assertion that the main motivation for taking the risk is that are concerned with the welfare of our planet?
Jeanette Barth actually made the statement rather than myself, but I would be more than happy to respond. To the question being, is fossil fuel our energy choice for the future? Fossil fuel is controlled by multinational corporations, and they control our economy. There are fuel sources that are available to everyone, rich and poor alike. They happen to come from the sun, the wind, the earth, and gravity. Whenever we choose to use that as our economic base and our energy base, we will rid ourselves of the huge mantle that we carry around on our shoulders from the oil and gas industry.
I have a question. I'm not sure who it's for, probably for Professor Christopherson. You made the recommendation, I've heard this before, that the way to approach gas development is to slow down, but a certain amount of infrastructure is necessary to develop the gas, and it seems to me that those two statements might be at cross purposes. In order for the gas to be developed, a certain amount of infrastructure is necessary, and in order to finance the infrastructure, a certain amount of gas development is necessary. So do you think that the industry could realistically come in at a slow pace, or is it a given that if they're going to come in at all, it would have to be at on a much larger scale in order to justify the construction of all this infrastructure? That's my first question, anyway.
I think that's an interesting question. I think that a certain amount of infrastructure probably is necessary. It's being constructed right now. And actually, the southern tier of New York is already being affected by drilling in northern Pennsylvania. We're part of this now. I think that my concern is that the damage to the environment and to local economies from accelerated drilling, especially risky speculative accelerated drilling, is such that slowing it down will allow communities to adapt to the process and will mitigate the damage. A lot of the damage comes from that fast ramp up. So if it's slower, it will ameliorate it. And the gas will still be there. The gas isn't going to go away. So I take your point, and I think it's a good point. But I would rather, through permitting, for example, slow the whole process down, and also allow us. I don't think New York is ready for natural gas drilling, for high volume hydraulic fracturing, for all the reasons we've heard. I just don't think that we're ready. And so I think we need to have better policies, taxes, other things in place.
Well, I guess it sort of answers the question, but not quite. But I guess my second 30-second question is just, it was mentioned that if we have this development, that it should be used for our economic benefit, but I don't understand how that is possible.
I think this gentleman has that a goal. The town of Caroline has been looking at the whole question of distributed energy. I disagree with Don to some extent because I've had students do research on wind power. Wind power is also owned by multinational corporations. There's industrial wind power, and it is not good. It's not good for the environment, and it's not good for communities. So I think that the experiments that are being done by communities who want to get off the grid, who want to experiment with district heating, with local alternatives, whether it's wind or solar or even natural gas, it has its benefits from an economic perspective in the sense that it creates independence from people and corporations that are driving this agenda.
I understand. In fact, I know that there is another fracking technique that has it all over hydrofracking. Could each of the speakers compare this new technology to the outmoded technology of hydrofracking with respect to the following? Radiation and salt, pond overflow, water pollution, the safety of the propant, the massive truck hauling, water subtraction, the relative productivity of the well, and the damage to the well, so that 10 or 20 years from now, when the Canadians invent a technique for secondary recovery, it will be possible.
Can you tell me what that technique is?
I'm amazed that you don't know. How could you take the stand without not knowing?
Well, you're talking about using propane?
It was in the Ithaca Journal. There were advertisements for 2 talks. 500 people came to those talks. I'm sure the people around the city talked about them a lot. It was on the radio, the advertisements, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
He's fully aware of that.
Who is?
All these people are.
We all are.
It's just,
Well, it's completely irrelevant, because why should we approve a technique that is outdated when there is a technique that solves all the problems you talked about? Economically solves those problems.
Can I try just a quick answer to that? The gel is propane. At pressures that are above its critical point, so it's not a gel like Jell-O, it's not like custard, it's a fluid, it flows. Propane is explosive. Propane tanks at houses and in gas stations and your grills are kept outdoors, and that's for a very good reason. They leak. Propane is heavier than air. It will settle in low places. If there's a wind, it will blow it away. If it's still, it will settle in low places and the propane will flow like water until it reaches a combustion source. This comes from Professor Ingraffi. He said there are thousands of joints, valves, pressure gauges, and a wellhead. All of them can leak. The fracking fluid that is being proposed is propane. Leaks of propane are potentially much more serious than leaks of water. I'm not convinced, and I've just begun to look at it, but I'm not convinced that propane is an improvement as a fracking fluid.
Thank you.
Propane is a hydrocarbon. So is methane. Methane is much more explosive than propane. That's why you use propane in the tank outside of your cooking unit, your outside cooking unit, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
The key word is outside. My propane tank is outside my house. The local law wouldn't let me put it in where I'm foolish enough to want to do so.
Why don't you just I think just take one stab at the economic question that was actually asked. And what we're dealing with, shale is a monolithic surface. It's like the concrete floor that we're standing on. And so we have to break that up in order to get the gas out. And you have to put wells down on a fairly regular basis in order for that to happen. And so the economic impact of creating a lot of wells has not changed by the fact that you've changed the fluid that you're going to use. You still need to have a lot of wells placed next to houses, in rural areas, in urban areas, in order to get to this gas. So some of the changes in the number of truck trips may be different, but the number of wells and the impacts on the rural landscape will not be changed.
My name's Stephen Emlin, and I heard about severance tax from each of you, I think, mentioned it. I know very little about severance tax. Is this something which other states have, and is something that could be done? Are there moves at the moment to sort of impose that here in New York State in order to capture some of this economic, or at least pay for the damages being done?
My understanding is that New York and Pennsylvania are among the few states that have no severance tax. I looked it up on Google, which is, one has to understand the limits of that. The word severance comes from severing, removing a natural resource, something of value from the ground. And so the tax would be on removing something of value, natural gas in this case, from our community. And we don't have one.
Are there moves afoot in the state assembly and senate to work on it? Yes.
Good.
Could I just add something to that, too? I think that when we enact a severance tax, if we do, we have to look at the tax that's enacted and at the effective tax. Many states have so many loopholes in their severance taxes that the effective tax rate is next to nothing. This is true, I think, in Colorado. So this is another reason for needing transparency when when the tax provisions are decided. We need to know what the loopholes are, because we can have it's like the corporate income tax, which is 35%, but the effective tax is 20%, and General Electric pays 3%. So the same thing applies to severance taxes. We have to know exactly what the effective tax is.
I have a two-part question. One is kind of a rephrasing of an earlier question. So, Dr. Christopherson, I think that implicit in what you've done with the boom and bust phase stuff is to imply that too much growth is actually a bad thing. We're accustomed to thinking that growth is good, but too rapid of growth leads to strains and problems. So I guess my question is, what is, in the economic thinking, sort of a reasonable growth rate that is sustainable, that doesn't cause more damage than good? And then the other point is for both Dr. Schwartz and Dr. Christopherson. You point out that it's modeling that shows all these great economic benefits. Then when one goes out and looks in the real world, as is in the Headwater study and elsewhere, and I'm sure you're aware of the work by Dr. Freudenberg, often we find negative impacts due to resource extraction. The criticism I've heard about applying the Headwaters to New York State is that's federal land out here, and here it's private land, and so it doesn't translate quite the same way. So I'm interested in hearing from this panel of experts what they would have to say about the applicability of the Headwaters work to the New York State economic picture.
The question you asked about the appropriate rate of growth is a really difficult question. The only thing I've been able to find was from a study, what you'd have to look at are threshold effects, and nobody has really looked at the point at which a community is overwhelmed by needs it can't respond to. For example, public safety needs or road maintenance. And there was a study done in Western resource communities years ago that said that a community can respond to a 5% a year change, the government policies and programs, but they can't respond to a 15%. Now, this is just, we've been trying to play around with this. It would take a lot of data gathering and measurement, which we haven't been able to do, but that was one indication that people are thinking about the thresholds at which it becomes too much. So, yes.
Yeah, in terms of the Energy West study, there are limitations on it. I'm not sure how important the federal ownership of land is on the jobs numbers that came out. That would be an important question. Another problem with it was for extracting coal, as well as gas and oil. So the question that came to me is there anything out there that I can look at that will give me some clue as what's going on? And that Energy West study is one, which is why I was delighted to find Barth's study, which looks at drilling in New York State, vertical wells, not horizontal fracturing, and the information in Pennsylvania, which is hydraulic fracturing. And they all seem to be fairly consistent in that the promise of jobs and is just doesn't show up.
I have I guess, two comments and then a question. First, the Barth study, I've read it, it's a good study, but the employment data is really out of date, and it's from before the real boom started. So there's a caution, and I hope she's updating those figures. On the first question about the overall carbon footprint of gas versus coal, I hope people will look at the Howarth study, Howarth, just Google that, and plus Cornell University, you'll get there. Shows that shale gas is worse than conventional gas, and both are worse than coal or oil in terms of the overall footprint. And obviously more study is needed. Question for Don and for Dr. Christofferson. You both indicate that, or Don, and the idea that planning, is the way to mitigate the ill effects, and Dr. Christofferson, the idea of pacing is the way to mitigate. Do you really think that's possible? Do you think that's realistic? I mean, Don, we've worked on this road law. Just that's one piece of it. How many municipalities in Tompkins County? Then you multiply by all the counties, et cetera. How realistic is that? Is that just, and then the idea of pacing. I don't know if the industry will tolerate what you're suggesting, Dr. Christofferson. Thanks.
So I'll go first. Want to know if it's realistic? I'm an eternal optimist, but I will say that this requires a lot of hard work. And if we continue, if it's not a high priority and we just push it off and let other things crowded out, then we won't put the energy into it. But this community can do amazing things when it decides that it wants to. And so, yes, the state has given us very little to work with as far as tools, but they haven't closed the door in a lot of places either. And so it's up to us to be creative and to work. And I have to say, I know that Martha, you're on the board for the IDA, and one of the comments I was going to make, and we were talking about multiplier effects. That's one of the things that the TCAD and the IDA make a strong part of their decision processes, is to maximize the multiplier effect of any projects that they work. And so we're doing that in Tompkins County. We have to continue it. And is it realistic? If we want to make this a priority, it is.
I just want to say, I agree, we have no choice, but I don't think it's sufficient.
I think that I agree with you. What I started out thinking was, if this happens and people have put forth their best effort to stop it, and then it comes, then where are we? And the question is how to at least plan and make some decisions. And I think that people have been doing that in surprising ways. Whether the natural gas companies will put up with it, I think that depends on the state taking a stand with regard to the permits. I think that's where the rubber meets the road. If they only permit as many wells as they can monitor, then the pace will get slowed down. That's where I see the brakes being put on. And I think putting the brakes on is really one of the few ways we have to control the negative impacts.
I just want to say I agree totally, and I just not to say we shouldn't plan, but I don't think it's going to solve the problem.
Can I make two quick comments on that? One, the Howarth study looks only at greenhouse gases and finds that gas drilling may be worse than coal. The Howarth and Ingraffia study does not look at the impact on the environment of drilling itself and spills and infrastructure. So that's important to keep in mind as you look at the Howarth and Ingraffia study. It's an important study, but pay attention to its limits because there's more going on. And that's fine.
My question concerns the recovery that the two of you are looking for after the And then that goes into what you were talking about the nature of the balancing of the economic interests which are now here. If we were rebuilding an automobile plant that would take 2 or 3 years to go from ground to functionality, I could see it in the context that you're talking about. But farming, tourism at this level, sportsmen, bird watchers, winemaking, these are things that take decades to establish. So how, in an area where the infrastructure would be built up, the bust you're talking about, from my understanding, has to do with inflated infrastructure where the people aren't there anymore and nobody can pay for it. So you put that as a burden on reestablishing what this area had developed in the last few decades, and it comes out there's no future.
Tony Serviente, Danby. Perhaps this was mentioned in some of the figures and talk that went by, and forgive me if it was, but it seemed to be absent. And so my perspective has been very recently one of looking at property value impacts, and I've spoken to a number of bankers, realtors, and assessors. And the consensus seems to be that one of two things will happen here if fracking does come. And one is nothing, and the other is a negative impact. There seems to be no projection of a positive impact for property values. So in the economic models and projections, if property value impacts in a negative direction were included, I could imagine that the impact would add a huge number to what we saw. And for most of us, our property, whether it be an acre or 10 or a home or whatever, is not only our single biggest current investment, but it's also what we might be looking toward for our retirement, or what we might leave as our children's inheritance. And so this is a very big issue for some of us that is actually having an impact already. Bankers, some banks are already declining mortgages for properties with service lease rights. Right. And they have indicated that they might start considering adjacent properties as impacting current properties. So it's not a hypothetical anymore. And so I guess my question is, has any of these things relating to property values been looked at either in Pennsylvania or elsewhere and compared to what we might face here?
This is a time I can do an advertisement for my students. My class this semester workshop is going to be giving a webinar on May 9th, I think 2 o'clock in the afternoon, sponsored by the Community and Regional Development Institute. And one group of the students has actually been looking across shale plays at the property value question, and they've had some really interesting findings. One of which is that the property values go down in the drilling area itself in the counties. But there's what they call a Goldilocks effect, where for some communities that are some distance from the drilling within the commuting shed, those values go up. So there's this odd pattern that seems to be occurring in different shale plays where around the drilling it's damaging, but people will move to adjacent middle-class communities and those values will go up. So anyway, they're going to present these results on May 9th at 2 o'clock in a webinar. So and the website is? It's the Community and Rural Development Institute. But if you go to my website, the Green Choices one, we'll post it there too.
Just a brief comment. This is an interesting example of how averages and individuals can come to very different conclusions. Mm-hmm. Yeah. If you happen to be living where the property level falls out from underneath you, you'll have a different outcome than if you're living in the neighboring community where the property level goes up. And that doesn't show up in the average.
Thank you very much. This has been wonderful. You're welcome.
Really well. Yeah. Being on the stage with you. I think that was ever going to happen. I'd be on the stage with you. This is great. You guys did a great job.